Thanks everybody, and Steve, what a great venue. Well, I better move on. I think we're sort of running a little time-wise. Microphone. Sorry about that. Microphone. Too many things to think about, Sab. Regen farming. So, look, as Paul said, we've been biological farming for 25 years, and now it's sort of regen. What does regen encompass? It's a balanced approach. So, regen can... Look, regen encompasses many farming methodologies. You know, it's not just about organic, and it's not just about ruling out chemicals. So it's a really very much a balanced approach. The big thing about regen is it's outcome-based, not input-based. So it's the results that you get out is what determines regen. And some of those outcome-based, of course, is soil health, laying down carbon, Ken was talking about. Sustainable, and I know sustainable is a big word, but it's also got to be sustainable in profit. You know, one thing I have found, if you're a profitable farm, you can afford to reinvest in your farm, and that could be to do with fencing off remnant vegetation, it could be to do with protecting waterways. It's about producing really good, quality, nutrient-rich, safe food. And it's about safe environmental outcomes. And it's not just your own farm. We really don't have the right to put so much nitrogen into the system or so much phosphorus in the system to damage the Wilson Inlet. In New Zealand right now, South Island, New Zealand, which is known for its pristine environment, since the dairy industry sort of taken on, so much nitrogen has been used and so much phosphorus has been used. In the world, now some of the New Zealand, South Island rivers are classified as some of the most polluted in the world. So that's a real issue in regen that we must make sure as farmers that we manage that environment. We help with that environment, we don't contribute to it. And it's a balanced approach. Look, for me, it's about farming the rhizosphere. You know, the rhizosphere is the interaction between a root system and a plant, minerals, microbes. And I call biology because it's not just about soil microbes, it's about insects. You know, it's about worms, it's about everything else that this diversity in biology, diversity in plants that Ken talked about. I think that is really critical. I believe there's two production drivers in a healthy soil and a productive soil. And is soil microbes, and Alan's going to talk a lot about that, so I won't talk too much about it. Other than the fungi are just so amazing. You know, they believe there's 2.5 million species of fungi in the world. There's a direct correlation between fungi numbers and diversity and lay down of recalcitrant carbon, which Ken talked about. So we need the fungi. So what we do in our farming practices, we've got to preserve the fungi and encourage them. Biological farming will sequence carbon. The second thing is remineralisation. And, you know, everybody says I'm pushing a bit of a barrow here. But you know what's interesting? They now have identified over 60 minerals that are critical for soil health, plant health, microbial health, and our health. And yes, we're in one of the oldest landforms in the world here. Our soils are poor. It's the biology that drives probably the forest. Our soils are very poor. We just can't look at the NPKs and some calcium and decide that's enough. I've found in the 25 years that I've been remineralising the difference it's made in our production, which I'll just talk a little bit later about. But the obvious benefit as a farmer, if I'm putting minerals on the soil, and we're talking about the little ones, so we're talking about selenium and cobalt and copper and many others, if I'm putting it on the soil, that gets into the food, that gets into the animals. I haven't used a lick block, I haven't used a supplement in our farm for 20 odd years. I don't have to inject magnesium into cows. And right now, I've spoken to a few farmers, particularly out west, but in this region as well, that they have selenium deficiency, copper deficiency, this day and age. So we have to concentrate on our minerals. I think they're very important. Mineralisation also improves microbial diversity. We call them our forgotten minerals. Now, you know, who knew that, say, vanadium is really important for reproduction performance and milk production in animals. Vanadium. Most people wouldn't know vanadium is germanium, nickel. So it's not just about the big minerals, it's about all the minerals. And so my principle was using all minerals as well as sulfates. It's the combination of between, if you like, the chemical and the biological. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to talk, if I get time a bit further on, is overuse of certain minerals cause lots of problems. Now, frankly, the overuse of lime, which is the way I see it is right now, is causing some of these deficiencies. MLA, so that's the Meat and Livestock Australia, have on their webpage, if you want to have a look at it, they have a technical sheet warning farmers who use lots of lime, lots of phosphate, what it does to trace minerals and how it affects your animals. So mineralisation, I see, is just as much the point as good soil biology. We moved away from high chemical. It's hard to determine what determined as conventional farming, high chemical use farming. We moved away from that on our property 25 years ago, and the catalyst for me was animal health. I seem to be a reactive farmer rather than a proactive farmer. You know, always chasing issues, whether it was issues within our pasture, whether it was scorch, powdery mildew, whether it was issues within our stock. You know, we run merinos. The lambing percentages I thought were very low. And if you look at the lambing percentages, so we're now running at about 125, 130% is our lambing percentage in merinos and over 110 in maiden ewes. When you look at the old literature, when you look at the old literature, the productive age of sheep, and I'm talking old literature, was between 4 and 8 years. Well, I can tell you now, the industry, the average culling of ewes is between 4 and 6 years. It's very expensive to replace a productive animal. And so that was the catalyst. In that period, and I founded or co-founded Australian Mineral Fertilisers, I worked with 3 scientists for over a decade. And there was a soil microbiologist, soil chemist, and a soil geologist. And a soil geologist is really interesting because a soil geologist looks at the nutritional value of minerals, not the mining value of minerals. One thing I noted then, and I still think it happens to some extent today, is there's very little communication between these scientists. So a soil chemist will be developing a system on chemistry and a soil microbiologist on biology, but when you bring them together, pennies start dropping. So that was really interesting. In that process, I was involved with over 45 different trials through Western Australia with these scientists. And we worked with the Ag Department in certain areas, but mainly we worked with Libby, Facey, and all these Ninan, all these different groups. What we looked at basically was looking at what a biological remineralisation program is against versus conventional, and conventional was district practice. And we had a whole pile of outcomes we really wanted to look at. And part of it, of course, is yield, but it was also about biological diversity, root mass, you know, root-shoot ratios. I have to refer to my list, there were so many of them. Anyway, so a huge amount of nutrient use, nutrient density, nutrient use efficiency in fertilisers. 4 things we came up that were consistent in most of the sites. And one was the effect of the rhizosphere. Remember, the rhizosphere is just the roots and all that biological activity in the soil, and the reaction with minerals and soil and clay. And we looked at nutrient use efficiency, and this is just purely a chart of looking at the nutrient use efficiency, that's of applied fertilisers and nutrient within the soil on an active rhizosphere. That means an active biological plant, an active biological system, compared to a sterile rhizosphere. Phosphorus was well up, but what was really interesting, the trace minerals, you're getting 3 times the availability on an active biological system. What does that mean? It means you can actually put a lot less fertiliser on, the NPK, to get the same result. You put less fertiliser on, not only is it better for the farmers and the cost better, of course, you don't risk leaching that fertiliser into the environment, which is a really serious issue. This is just one of the sites, and we had many sites that reflected this, but this is just a classic example of what I want to show you. So there we had the mineralised microbial type program versus conventional. There was about half the amount of applied P, yet there was 20% more P in the tissue. This is about nutrient availability. Of course, on the biological program, we had 12 times the colonisation, mycorrhizal colonization per centimetre of root. And we had a yield response. So engaging biology really improves the nutrient use efficiency of fertiliser. This is another thing, a second thing that we found absolutely consistently, and this was just really interesting. So here we have just a bunch of root systems. Now, a root system and rhizosphere go hand in hand. Bigger root system, bigger rhizosphere, more area to absorb nutrient, more area for oxygen, more area for water, the whole thing. So we found that if you had a lot of soluble nitrogen in the system, and this was down the boot in the system, it had a big effect on mycorrhizal fungi, had effect on fungi, had effect on root development, and had effect on rhizosphere. So even on just the straight biological system, the root mass was absolutely significant, up to 10 times the root mass. And one of the criticisms at the time was that, oh, well, it's about the plant being hungry and looking for nutrient, and you'll get a big root system, but you won't get a respective in yield or in shoot growth. Well, the brown is the dry weight of shoots. We believe most plants should have a root-shoot ratio of 50-50. Trees have it. As big as you see that tree, you'll know it correspondingly in the soil is the same sort of root system. If you want to build carbon, you want to sequence carbon, you need a really good root system. If you want to hang off on dry times, and if you want best moisture harvesting ability. Look, in here, so we put microbes. So everyone, you'll see the plus microbes here. So we added the same microbes, 12 species, including mycorrhizal fungi, with down the boot with the system. You add a fungicide, which is, might sound pretty obvious if you want to keep your fungi and you add a fungicide. It had a significant difference in root development, had a significant difference in rhizosphere, had a significant difference in nutrient uptake. You want to use a fungicide in the soil, you'll damage the biology, you need to increase your fertiliser inputs to get the similar sort of result. But what I want to say, it's not about, I don't say that I'm going to say fungicide's bad and you shouldn't use it, because the reality is, even in regen, chemical practice still has its place. It's how and when you use it. So if you're using a fungicide, you wouldn't put it in the soil. You might use it as a topical or a topical spray, as long as it's not systemic and goes into the root system. And when we worked through that, and I'll come up a bit later about that, when we looked at that, the damage was significantly less. So it might be one step forward or two steps forward and one step back. But I'm not going to bag chemicals because they have a place. We have all this knowledge about chemical farming. It's just that, unfortunately, we'd have very little knowledge about biological farming, and for me, it is the key driver. So that's a very graphical example of what your inputs are and how they can affect that and how they can affect the biology. This was a really interesting research we were involved with, and it was over 3 years. And all it was, and once again, I'm not bagging chemicals, I just want to explain to you that, like if you go to a doctor and they give you a drug, a good doctor will say, these are the side effects, and you need to deal with it. Well, in farming, if you're using chemicals, they have side effects. Every action can have a reaction. And this is just an example of that. So I'm not going to go in. Sorry, can you all hear me? Oh, sorry. So you haven't heard any of it. Sorry about that. So if you go to the doctor and they want to, and you give a medicine, they should tell you about the side effects. Look, using chemicals in farming on a biological system, you need to know that. And I tell you what, we only know a tiny bit. And it wasn't our job as a business and as a bunch of scientists to go and try to identify all these chemicals, which we didn't probably want to use that much, to see the effect on different microbes. So what we've got here is we've just got arranged 4 different microbes we looked at: mycorrhiza, Pseudomonas, Actinomyces and Protozoa. And we measured and we did 75 treatments, and we looked at all to do with herbicides, and we just looked at pre and post-emergent herbicides and knockdown herbicides and what the difference is. Now, the one to the right, and this was all on a biological farming system, by the way. The ones on the left of the screen was control, no herbicides at all. And you can see the higher levels of these different microbes. But mycorrhizal fungi was a classic. But when you look through, some of the applications of herbicide didn't damage the mycorrhizal fungi as much. So that's an opportunity. And interestingly enough, and I'm not going to go into the chemical names, some herbicides actually took out protozoa totally. We could not identify the protozoa in the sites. Now, protozoa, and I'm sure Alan will talk about it, is a critical nutrient recycler. So all these things have this little bit of a side effect that we have to consider when we're doing it. But I'm not ruling out that's not being used on a biological or a regenerative system. This is not ours, but this is interesting work that was done in South America. And these scientists put together, they wanted to look, and the nitrogen fixing Ken was talking about, they wanted to look at what the effect of various different pesticides, that's fungicides, insecticides, and herbicides, have on nitrogen fixing bacteria. They had free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, plus rhizobia, which most of us would know about, is part of a legume. Basically, they estimate that nitrogen fixers convert 200 million tonnes of nitrogen to ammonium annually. So the biology is producing all this nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen or for legumes, 200 million tonnes annually. This is in the world. I mean, I don't know how many billions of dollars of nitrogen that really is, but it's a lot. They also identified that one application of many different pesticides halved the number of nitrogen fixers, both as the rhizobia on root system and as the free-living nitrogens halved it. I'm not saying, don't go and use any pesticides, but I'm saying you just have to be aware of that. On our own property, our highest hay cut, was 18 tonnes to the hectare, and we used about 5 to 7 units of N. And we probably didn't even do that, but it just went down. So I'm just endorsing what you've been saying, is that the biological system really is a good system, but it doesn't have to be isolated into one system. The next thing we looked at was the buffering ability of soils under a good biological system. Now, this is just a pH, because lime, for me, there's an issue with us putting heaps of lime on just when we monitor pH. So this is the soil buffering ability. So there's the stained areas. You can see the different pH. So in an active living rhizosphere, when the plant's alive, unless it's a perennial, then it's probably always alive, you'll have a fairly big impact in buffering your pH. So the soil pH might only be 5.5, 6, yet around that rhizosphere it can change. Now this also means for oxygen, water, and so many different things. Going to our own property, this paddock here, and I have had many scientists on this paddock and agronomists internationally as well. In fact, sometimes I think there's more people been wandering on over than sheep. But I really want to say this is a practical example. And this is what I'm about. I'm a farmer. I want to see that result, and I've got to receive that in profit and production. But this is a practical example. So here we have as a pH of 4.8 to 5.4 in water. Now, I know that I would be advised by many people to put 3 to 5 tonnes of lime on per hectare and 500 kilos a year. No, I look at calcium levels in the soil, and I look at aluminium as a decider where calcium is needed. Remember, lime is calcium, basically, or calcium carbonate. The sodium was 0.2 to 0.3 conductivity. which is sort of nearly called sodic. And exchangeable sodium was 10.5 to 13, and potassium was 1.5. And I know these are just figures, but what it's saying is there's a fair bit of sodium in there, and technically there's more sodium available than potassium. And they're just two photos. I did 2013 and 2020. We have this amazing production there. We have amazingly deep soil. We have 7 to 8% organic matter. And yet I know that productivity, that is the buffering ability that we're getting out of a biological system. And so I look at lime quite differently than, and I think people on a biological system should look at lime quite differently than a chemical system. Chemical system, sure enough, you might need all that lime, but I tell you what, it's really expensive. And another little point I just have to say is that when you put lime as calcium carbonate, when you put it on an acid soil, what happens? It releases carbon dioxide. So there is actually a carbon footprint. By you liming, you're actually adding carbon to the atmosphere. So I think things are starting to have to be thought. This is a sort of soil test I do. No, I do comprehensive soil tests as well, and they're cation exchange, and they're like the Albrecht model. This is about a biological test. And so these give indications of how well your soil is performing on nutrient cycling, on availability of general nutrients, moisture, and a whole pile of parameters is in like the dashboard you see there. And on the right-hand side, it gives you a bunch of different selected microbes, and you've got to remember this is probably 0.00001% of the microbes in the soil, let alone what they don't know. However, just key ones of how they are performing. And then to the right, it then calculates the nutrient. And I can tell you, these soil sampling is done exactly the same methodology as these biological sampling as soil sampling, and the same sample that I'd send to a different lab, my production reflected this rather than a soil test. However, soil tests are very important. Just going through back to the productive age of sheep. They're our girls. Unfortunately, it gets very sad when you've had them for 9 years. But we sold them only January this year. So our productive age of our ewes is now 8 to 9. Now, ewes are worth about $250 a head. So if you can keep them a few extra years because their nutrition's right, and that's what it pays. And the same happens for our lambing percentage. Just some shots. And it's just so fantastic to be able to go and farm, because I'm now, I would say, not reactive, so much anymore. I found it has made my life very simple. I don't have to get lick blocks. I don't have to worry about if I've got a deficiency. I mean, Denmark's famous for the Denmark wasting disease, which is a selenium deficiency. So it makes life a lot easier. Engaging with biology, not ruling out chemical, middle of the road sort of approach is really important. Oh, right, in summary, look, and really I've probably covered it all, but a healthy, diverse soil biology, we talked about biodiversity. It's so important. I know we might have 30 species of pasture species. I don't particularly treat weeds like average cropper might treat weed. All of them seem to have a function. All of them seem to add the biodiversity, they add to the nutritional value, and they add to our feed value. We're running equivalent to 19 DSE per hectare, which is apparently, according to the survey on our property, is nearly double the district stocking rates. The other thing, I would like to reiterate that biological farming does not preclude the use of chemicals. It's just understanding there's an effect and we have to look at it. And I'm hoping that, like the Department of Ag, this is where perhaps they could be looking more at it. So then we have just an informed decision-making process. Liming, I've already talked about that. But on another thing, I just think that I've also found, and I'm not sure, this is definitely related, is that if you overuse one mineral, you can induce deficiencies in many other minerals. So it's got to be a really balanced approach. Yeah, I think that's probably wraps it up in a bit. Thank you.